Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're looking at the situation in Ukraine.
Okay.
More specifically, the challenges they're facing trying to keep up their military forces.
Yeah.
We've got some interesting articles from Mundo and Unheard, and they offer some pretty different perspectives.
Right.
Linda, what was your first reaction to the material?
Well, Robert, the thing that really struck me right away is the contrast between the UK's promises of support and the actual reality for those on the ground in Ukraine.
Right.
You've got Keir Starmer visiting Kyiv, pledging billions in aid using words like indefinite commitment.
Okay.
And then on the other hand, you've got reports from Ukraine painting this picture of economic distress and a struggle to recruit young people.
Yeah, it's almost like two separate narratives happening at the same time.
Right.
You see these big gestures of support from countries like the UK.
Yeah.
And then you kind of zoom in and see the real struggles that Ukrainians are facing every day.
Right.
Let's unpack this a little bit. And maybe let's start with those promises from the UK.
All right.
What are your initial thoughts on Starmer's recent visit and this new agreement, Linda?
On the surface, Robert, a pledge of £3 billion in aid sounds pretty substantial.
Yeah.
However, the Unheard article really kind of digs into how realistic these promises are.
Yeah.
The author, Anatol Levin, actually calls them fantasies.
No.
And he points to the UK's own economic troubles, arguing that, these big long-term commitments might not be realistic.
Yeah, you're right. Levin, he doesn't really hold back.
Nope.
He even suggests that the UK might be misleading Ukraine with promises they can't actually keep. Do you think there's a chance that this kind of talk, regardless of intention, could backfire and hurt Ukraine's position later on, especially when it comes to future negotiations?
That's a really good point, Robert, and it's a valid concern.
Yeah.
If Ukraine is depending on this indefinite support and then it doesn't actually happen the way it was promised, it could really weaken their negotiating power when they finally get to peace talks.
Okay.
Levin thinks that a negotiated settlement is the most likely outcome.
Right.
Probably involving some tough compromises.
Right.
And that's definitely something to keep in mind.
That's a great point.
Thanks.
So the UK is pushing this narrative of a decisive Ukrainian victory. But that could lead to some unrealistic expectations for Ukraine.
Right.
And then make those necessary compromises even harder to swallow.
Exactly. And it connects to another thing Levin brings up.
Okay.
This idea of a European peacekeeping force in Ukraine after the war.
Interesting.
He basically dismisses it as another fantasy.
Wow.
He says it would be unacceptable to Russia.
All right.
And that the U.S., especially under someone like Trump, has shown zero interest in providing the security guarantees that kind of force would need.
So we're seeing these grand promises from the UK.
Right.
Which, maybe they can keep them, maybe they can't.
Both.
But let's shift gears a little and focus on what's happening inside Ukraine.
Okay.
The Mundo article highlights some pretty big challenges.
Yes.
Especially when it comes to strengthening their military.
Yeah.
What really stood out to you, Linda?
Well, Robert, the article really emphasizes how much Ukraine is struggling to get new soldiers.
Okay.
Especially young people. And what's really concerning are the suggestions from some U.S. officials to actually lower the draft age in Ukraine to 18.
Wow. That's a pretty drastic move.
It is.
Imagine being 18 years old.
Yeah.
And being told you might have to go fight on the front lines.
It's a lot.
It's no surprise that there's pushback against that idea, both inside Ukraine and from other countries.
Right. You've got the obvious ethical concerns. But there are other good arguments against lowering the draft age, too.
Okay.
The El Mundo article quotes this Ukrainian military analyst named Oleksandr Kovalenko.
Okay.
And he calls this idea simplistic and ineffective.
Interesting.
He believes that Ukraine still has a lot of potential recruits.
Okay.
Between 25 and 60 that they haven't even tapped into yet.
So he's saying that just throwing more bodies at the problem.
Right.
Especially inexperienced 18-year-olds isn't the answer.
Exactly.
Makes sense.
Yeah. And a few people in the El Mundo article say that focusing on the quality of the troops would be much better.
Right.
Give them good training, modern weapons, and build up a more motivated fighting force.
Okay.
They think that'll make a bigger difference than just having a huge army on paper.
That makes a lot of sense.
It does.
But it sounds like President Zelensky might be pushing back against lowering the draft age.
You're right.
At least for now.
Yeah, the El Mundo article points out that Zelensky is against lowering the draft age.
Okay.
And that he's more focused on getting more and better weapons from Western allies.
Interesting.
He seems to think that investing in the forces and equipment they already have is a smarter way to go.
So it seems like there's a difference of opinion between what some U.S. officials want and what the Ukrainian leaders actually want.
Yeah.
But this actually raises a really important point.
What's that?
The economic situation in Ukraine.
Oh, right.
It plays a huge role in all of this.
Absolutely.
The Telegraph article paints a pretty grim picture of the economic hardships Ukrainians are going through right now.
Yeah, it does.
Can you tell our listener a little more about that?
Sure.
Okay.
Telegraph highlights things like skyrocketing inflation,
Okay.
incomes that aren't growing,
Right.
and more people struggling to afford basic stuff.
Yeah.
This is especially bad for the poorest people.
Uh-huh.
An economist named Oleg Penzen is quoted in the article,
Okay.
and he says that real incomes are actually going down for these groups.
And this economic distress has a direct impact on their ability to recruit soldiers, right?
Totally.
If people are already struggling to put food on the table,
Yeah.
it's hard to imagine military service being very appealing.
Exactly, Robert.
Yeah.
And the El Mundo article mentions this too. They say that some wealthier citizens can avoid military service altogether,
Oh, wow.
which just makes things worse.
Yeah.
It creates more resentment and makes it even harder to convince young people from poorer backgrounds to sign up.
It's like a vicious cycle.
Totally.
The war is causing economic problems,
Yeah.
which makes it harder to recruit soldiers,
Right.
which then weakens Ukraine's ability to fight the war.
It's a tough spot.
It really is.
Yeah.
How can Ukraine break free from this cycle?
It's a really good question.
Yeah,
It's a difficult situation for sure.
right.
If people are having trouble just meeting their basic needs,
Yeah.
what can the government offer to convince them to risk their lives on the front lines?
Right.
What kind of incentives can they give when the economy is already so shaky?
It seems like they're facing a really tough task.
It is.
If just adding more recruits, especially by lowering the draft age, isn't a good solution,
Right.
what does the El Mundo article suggest they should focus on?
Well, they propose a bunch of possible solutions. They talk about the importance of reforming military command structures,
Interesting.
improving the quality of training for new recruits,
Okay.
offering better benefits for the people who serve, and making sure their rights are protected.
That makes sense.
It's more about making military service a real profession,
Right.
making it more attractive, rather than just trying to hit a certain number of soldiers.
That seems like a more sustainable approach,
I think so.
addressing the root causes
Yeah.
instead of doing things that might feel coercive.
Mm-hmm.
Could be a better strategy in the long run.
Exactly. And there's also been talk about offering money as an incentive,
Okay, like what?
like signing bonuses
Right.
and higher monthly payments for soldiers.
That could be helpful,
It could.
especially with the job market shrinking and the cost of living going up.
Absolutely.
Those incentives could be really important.
Yeah.
If you want to attract and keep talented, motivated people,
Right.
you have to offer them something competitive, especially when things are uncertain economically.
You make a good point.
Thanks.
And it's not just about getting new recruits. It's
Right.
about keeping the experienced soldiers you already have
Yeah.
and giving them opportunities to grow professionally.
Okay.
If Ukraine wants to build a really strong military,
Yeah.
they need to create an environment where people want to stay and get better at their jobs over time.
So we've covered quite a bit.
We have.
The UK's promises,
Mhm.
the challenges of recruiting in Ukraine,
Yeah.
and the big impact of the economy.
Uh-huh.
What's your overall take on everything right now?
It's a mixed bag.
Okay.
On the one hand, you have the amazing resilience of the Ukrainian people,
Mm-hmm.
their determination to defend their country and all
Yeah.
the support they're getting from other countries.
Right.
But then there are some serious obstacles,
Right.
both inside and outside the country,
Yeah.
that are making this fight incredibly tough.
It's interesting how some of those obstacles seem to contradict each other.
That's true.
You have the UK pledging massive long-term support,
Right.
which is great.
It is.
But at the same time,
Yeah.
they're painting this super optimistic picture of how the war will end,
Mhm.
which could end up hurting Ukraine when it comes to negotiating.
Right.
What do you think?
It's a delicate balance for sure.
Yeah.
And then you have these struggles within Ukraine.
Right.
The need to build up their military
Hmm.
is running up against these economic problems.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that they don't want to do things that are unpopular,
Right.
like lowering the draft age,
Yeah.
It's a tough spot for them.
It is.
They're trying to defend their country, but also protect their future as a nation.
It's definitely a balancing act.
Yeah. We can't forget the human cost.
You're right.
Behind all the politics and strategy are ordinary Ukrainians whose lives have been turned upside down by this war.
Oh, yeah.
They're the ones dealing with that economic hardship, making really tough choices about their futures.
No.
And a lot of them are risking their lives on the front lines.
Absolutely there. We have to remember that part of it.
We do.
It's easy to get caught up in the big picture.
Right.
And forget about the real people this is affecting.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, it's the Ukrainian people who will decide what happens to their country.
Exactly.
Their resilience, their determination, and their sacrifices. Those are the things that have allowed them to get through this so far.
Right.
And their vision for the future is what will guide them as they keep going through this incredibly difficult situation.
It's a powerful reminder.
It is.
Of what's really at stake here.
Yeah.
And how important the decisions being made are.
For sure.
Both inside Ukraine and in the rest of the world.
Yeah. What do you think about that?
I completely agree.
Oh.
It's incredible how courageous and resilient they are.
It is.
But it also shows how much responsibility the people in power have to make decisions that will affect millions of lives.
You're absolutely right. This has been really enlightening, Linda.
It has.
Thank you for sharing your insights.
You're welcome.
I'm sure our listeners gotten a lot out of your analysis.
I hope so.
So we've gone through a lot of information and analysis today.
Yeah.
It seems like Ukraine is facing a tough battle.
It does.
On many different fronts. What's your main takeaway from all of this?
You know, Robert, what really stands out to me is the uncertainty.
Okay.
We hear these big promises of support.
Yeah.
But who knows how long they'll actually last.
Right.
And then you have this internal struggle to gather resources and manpower.
Yeah.
All while trying to rebuild a sense of normalcy.
Right.
In the middle of a war.
It makes you wonder what it'll really take for Ukraine to achieve lasting peace and what role the rest of the world will play in that.
That's a great point.
It seems like the future of Ukraine is up in the air.
It does.
With so many factors at play.
So many.
And to our listener.
Yeah.
We'd love to know what you think.
We would.
What stood out to you the most from our deep dive into the situation in Ukraine?
Let us know.
Share your thoughts and join the conversation.
And it seems like there's a bit of a disconnect there, Robert, between what some U.S. officials are suggesting and what the Ukrainian leadership is actually pushing for.
Right.
But it raises a really important point.
Okay, what's that?
The economic situation in Ukraine.
Oh, yeah, of course.
It's a huge factor in all of this.
Absolutely. The Telegraph article paints a pretty bleak picture.
Yeah.
Of the economic struggles that Ukrainians are facing.
It's tough.
Can you give our listener a little more detail on that?
Sure. Robert Telegraph talks about things like soaring inflation.
Okay.
Incomes that are basically stagnant.
Right.
And a growing number of people who can't even afford basic necessities.
It's a really tough situation.
It is. And it's especially bad for the poorest people.
Yeah, that makes sense.
There's an economist named Oleg Pensin who's quoted in the article.
Okay.
And he says that real incomes are actually falling for those groups.
Wow. And so this economic distress directly impacts their ability to recruit soldiers. Right?
Absolutely.
Because if people are already struggling to put food on the table,
right,
it's hard to imagine them being eager to join the military.
Exactly. Robert, and the El Mundo article mentions this too.
Okay.
They say that some wealthier citizens are actually able to avoid military service completely.
Oh, wow. So it's like a two-tier system.
It kind of is, and that just adds to the resentment.
Makes sense.
And makes it even harder to convince young people from poorer backgrounds to enlist.
It's like this vicious cycle.
Totally.
The war is causing economic hardship.
Yeah.
Which makes it harder to recruit soldiers.
Right.
Which, in turn, weakens their ability to fight the war effectively.
Exactly. It's a really tough spot to be in.
It is. How can they possibly break free from that cycle?
That's the million-dollar question, Robert. It's a really complex situation.
Yeah.
If people are struggling just to meet their basic needs, what can the government possibly offer them to convince them to risk their lives on the front lines?
Yeah.
What kind of incentives can they even provide when the economy is already in such bad shape?
It seems like a monumental task.
It is, and if simply adding more recruits, especially by lowering the draft age, isn't a good solution,
right?
What are some of the alternatives that the El Mundo article suggests?
Well, they offer a number of potential solutions.
Okay.
They talk about the importance of reforming the military command structures,
Interesting.
improving the quality of training for new recruits,
Okay.
offering better benefits for the people who serve, and ensuring that their rights are protected.
So basically making military service more appealing
Exactly.
rather than forcing people into it.
Right, it's about professionalizing it and making it a more attractive career path.
That seems like a much more sustainable approach.
I agree. It's about addressing the root causes instead of resorting to measures that could be seen as coercive.
That could be a more effective strategy in the long run.
Absolutely. And there's also been discussion about offering financial incentives.
Yeah, things like signing bonuses
Okay.
and increased monthly payments for soldiers.
That could definitely help.
It could, especially when you consider that the civilian job market is shrinking
Right.
and the cost of living is on the rise.
Those incentives could be crucial.
They could, because
Yeah.
if you want to attract and retain talented and motivated people,
Yeah.
you need to offer them a competitive package,
Makes sense.
especially in a time of economic uncertainty.
Right. It's not just about attracting new recruits either.
Exactly.
It's also about keeping the experienced soldiers you already have.
Yeah, and providing them with opportunities for professional development.
Okay.
If Ukraine wants to build a truly strong and resilient military, they need to create an environment where people are incentivized to stay
Yeah.
and develop their skills over the long term.
So, Linda, we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the UK's promises of support,
Yeah.
the challenges of recruitment in Ukraine, and the enormous impact of the economic situation.
It's all connected.
It really is.
Yeah.
What's your overall assessment of the current state of affairs?
To be honest, Robert, it's a complicated picture.
Okay.
There are both positive and concerning elements.
Okay.
On one hand, you have the incredible resilience of the Ukrainian people,
Yeah.
their determination to defend their country.
Right. And the support they're receiving from international partners.
It's impressive.
It is.
Yeah.
But on the other hand,
Yeah,
there's some very real obstacles,
there are.
both internal and external,
Right.
that are making this fight incredibly challenging. It's interesting, Linda,
What is?
how some of those obstacles seem almost contradictory.
Oh, I see what you mean.
You have the UK pledging this massive long-term support,
Uh-huh.
which is obviously a good thing.
It is.
But at the same time,
Yeah.
they're painting this very optimistic picture of the war's outcome, which could potentially create unrealistic expectations and ultimately harm Ukraine's position in any future negotiations.
That's a good point.
What are your thoughts on that?
It's a delicate balance for sure.
Yeah.
And then you have these internal struggles within Ukraine, this
Yeah.
urgent need to strengthen their military,
Yeah.
but they're running up against economic hardship and a reluctance to implement measures that could be very unpopular.
Like lowering the draft age.
Exactly. It's a tough spot for them to be in.
It really is.
Trying to defend their territory
Right.
while also safeguarding their future as a nation.
It's a delicate balancing act.
It is. And amidst all of this, we can't forget the human cost.
Absolutely.
Behind all the political maneuvering and strategic debates are ordinary Ukrainian citizens whose lives have been completely upended by this war.
It's easy to forget about them when we're discussing these big picture issues.
It is, but they're the ones bearing the brunt of the economic hardship.
Right.
Making incredibly difficult choices about their future, and in many cases, risking their lives on the front lines.
It's a powerful reminder of the real stakes involved
It is.
and the weight of these decisions,
Absolutely.
both within Ukraine and on the international stage.
Do you agree?
I completely agree, Linda. It's a truly remarkable display of courage and resilience.
It is.
But it also underscores the immense responsibility
Yeah.
that those in positions of power have to make decisions that will ultimately impact the lives of millions of people.
They have a lot on their shoulders.
They do. This deep dive has been incredibly enlightening, Linda.
It has.
Thank you for sharing your expertise with me and our listener.
It's been my pleasure, Robert.
I'm sure our listeners gained a lot of insight from your analysis.
I hope so. It's
Yeah.
always fascinating to delve into these complex issues and try to make sense of all the different perspectives.
Absolutely. I'm always learning something new.
Me too.
Well, Linda, this has been a whirlwind of information and analysis.
It really has.
It seems like Ukraine is facing an uphill battle on multiple fronts.
Yeah, it does.
Do you have any final thoughts or takeaways for our listener before we wrap up?
You know, for me, Robert, it's the human element that really sticks out.
Okay.
On one hand, you've got all this political maneuvering and these big promises of support.
Right.
But then when you look at what's happening on the ground, it's the ordinary Ukrainian citizens
Yeah.
who are bearing the weight of this conflict. They're the ones facing economic hardship and having to make tough choices about their future.
It's a really difficult situation.
It is, and it makes you wonder what it'll really take for Ukraine to rebuild and secure a lasting peace.
That's a powerful thought, Linda. A lot to ponder there.
Definitely.
And to our listener out there, we'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yes, we would.
What stood out to you from this deep dive?
Let us know.
Join the conversation.